Greetings and blessings, family. Today is May 10th. I'll leave the date in the description. And I've been up at the farm for about 9 hours. It looks like we're out of the window for our last frost. We had our last frost about 3 weeks ago. It was actually a freeze, but that freeze is also the last time it frosted. And I've just been keeping a heavy watch on it the past few weeks, and it doesn't look like we're gonna get any more frosts. So it was doing the tomatoes, the warm weather loving crops, tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants more harm than good at this point to leave them in their pots any longer. So I planted all the warm weather loving crops. I direct sowed some corns and some pumpkin seed and some squash seed. And I'm just gonna take you on an in-depth garden tour because when we look at it right now, it doesn't look like much. And then in 3 months, it explodes. Everything grows with very vigorous growth, and then you can't even walk in the garden. So it's best to take a look around now, do an in-depth observation, look at all the work I just did today, and then we can come back to this video in a few months when everything has started to flourish. It got up to 87 yesterday, so with that summer-like heat, everything just went whoop and grew a little bit. So let's get into this garden tour. Let's get into what's going on here. Grab your cup of tea, kick back, and let's get into it. Okay. Gate open. We got the lettuce. Gotta put the stick back in. Okay. So we got this lettuce that is looking to harvest in about 3 weeks, which is around June 5th. And it was started around the last week of February in my living room, transplanted on March 31st, and it's gonna harvest around June 5th. Now, at my other garden, I had, in years past, usually just direct sown because I had workable soil, not just inches of wood chips. I would direct sow around April 6th and harvest around June 9th for the first farmer's market. So it's very amazing to see that whether you direct sow or whether you transplant under agribon cover, with an unheated greenhouse, you're still gonna harvest your first batch of greens in the first week of June in southern Vermont. With the amount of low daylight levels that we have and temperature fluctuations that we have, that's just what you're looking at. But now if I had the space, right, imagine if my whole living room wasn't filled with all those warm weather loving crops that we're gonna go over that I just planted, and I had enough space to start a tray of lettuce every week since the last week in February. Then when this harvests on around June 5th, it would lead it up to have another batch to harvest and another batch to harvest. And I've done my best at doing that succession, but the successions are anywhere from like a week to 2 weeks apart from each other. Or I mean, like, yeah, a week and a half to 2 weeks apart from each other, and you would want it a week by week. But this lettuce that got this cover was on this lettuce, and it blew off, and I just didn't try to cover it up. And this is the one that I would always direct sow around April, early April, and harvest for the first time around early June. So looks like that's gonna still happen. Red oak leaf lettuce, very cold hardy, highly would recommend it. This has been outside since March 31st, no protection. Seen that freeze down to 28, multiple freezes, multiple frosts. And I had observation realization today. There was one little kale transplant that I just said, I got one left, let me stick it over here. Because when I transplanted my first succession back in late April, 150 kohlrabi, 150 kale, 150 Swiss chard. I transplanted them, and in about 3 days they got completely decimated by slugs, and the brassicas got eaten by flea beetles or slugs. But the kale that I transplanted over here, looking west, where it gets more sun, that kale survived, and we'll take a look at that kale when we go over there. So I realized that if I transplanted my first succession on that side of the garden, which is north but west and east, so it gets full sun all day and not tucked in this little shady nook that's very close to this 24/7 running river, and now that everything's growing in, it just keeps this whole side of the garden very moist, which, since this side of the garden stays very moist, that's why there's more slugs on this side, as to where when you get full sun from the west and the sun's going down, it gets too hot and too dry, and the slugs can't survive right here, so they got to go somewhere that they can survive. So that was a cool observation and realization, because I was like, dang, what the heck happened? Also, a note on that is that I didn't let them grow big enough. The ideal transplanting date is 3 to 4 weeks old, but since I started them in the beginning of April and it was still so cold and shorter day length, they weren't of a nice transplantable size. Should have let them get a little bit bigger before I transplanted them. That way, if the slugs that came, they wouldn't have been able to get completely disintegrated. Maybe they still would have, but they would have had a better chance of surviving because they had more leaf growth on them. Garlic's looking great. I've deciphered all 17 to 18 different varieties, and the peas are looking good. Oregon snow pea coming up. We got to kind of go over here to understand what's going on. So I just did New England pie pumpkin around the entire border from my own saved seed that I've been saving since 2021. Intermixed right here, peas, then there's a row of strawberries. There's 3 cottonwood tree transplants. There's spearmint transplants intermixed between every one of those cottonwood trees, and then there's elderberry cuttings, and then there's willow cuttings. There's also willow cuttings around the entire perimeter. to root them and help with making a living wall slash contamination barrier. There is a convectional orchard about a mile over that hill, and in the summertime the direct wind comes from that way. So we have a nice hedgerow buffer, but there is that little opening for the road, and there is a questionable cornfield also up at the top of that hill, like farther away, and then there's another tree border, and then it's like the next property over. But so just to try to kind of help with filtration and any possible blowing contaminants in the air. I know there's a whole bunch of stuff up there, but we try to have the least amount of contamination possible that is within inside of my control. So that's why there's willows around the entire border, because then they root and grow up, and then there'll be a living wall. Elderberry is the same thing. So if we take a walk down this path, little weed pressure, not much in the garlic. I'm gonna come lay grass